Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We assume from our previous webinars that we have people joining us from around the world, and I want to acknowledge all the various time zones and people joining us. I'm Kathy Alm. I am the CEO of PATH International, and this is the third free webinar that we have hosted specific to subjects most relevant during this pandemic. One of the themes running through all of these webinars, as evidenced by the fact that we currently have 710 people on this webinar with 1,000 who have signed up. You're not alone. You are not alone. PATH International is here to support you, as is hundreds and thousands of members from around the world. I want to thank you again for joining us. We're going to start by some demographic polls. We like to know who's on the phone with us. So Brett, if you would put up the first poll.
We have our first poll results there for you, Kathy.
Okay, there they are. So just to give us an idea of where everybody is at, 54% of you are in the Eastern time zone, 24% are Central, 11% Pacific, Alaska, or Hawaii, and 10% Mountain Time, and we have 1% International. Brett, do we have the other poll going?
I will go ahead and open it now.
Okay. A couple of logistics before I kick us off. Today's recording will be available to you as quickly as we can turn it around. In addition, there are numerous handouts in the handout section of your menu we have posted numerous resources that you can download from that handout section, or we will also be distributing that along with the recorded webinar after today. In addition, we will post the webinar and all of those resources on our website, so you can always access that on our website. During the webinar, please use either the chat function or the question function in order to post any questions. As you can imagine, with over 730 people on a call, we can't exactly unmute everybody. We will do our best to answer your questions today, but know that because of the volume, we may not get to everybody. But if we don't get to your question today, we will download those questions and follow up and answer them after the fact. Okay, next poll answer. We have 45% volunteers or instructor, 41% program director or head instructor, 30% administrators, 12% other, and 10% therapists. Well, again, welcome and thank you for joining us today. So I want to start today by sharing some data we collected about the impact of COVID-19 on our members. This survey went out and was gathered last week, and what you see is that what we found is that although 84% of center respondents had suspended operations, 80% were definitely planning to reopen, with only 2% permanently closed. I'm not making light of that 2% that had to close. It's heartbreaking. But I was happy to see the hope that I saw in the response to this survey question. We also asked individuals if they were planning to stay in the industry once things were reopened, and 98% said yes, they were planning to stay within this industry. We also asked, in particular for this webinar, does your center have a reopening plan? 62% already have a plan or a plan in progress, and the others are most likely thinking about it and working on it. We will continue to survey membership to see how all of this changes so we understand the trends and what's happening with all of you. Okay, I'm going to touch on topics with guidelines that do apply to everyone. I want to be clear that this is about giving you factual information and, where appropriate, examples. It's important that everybody understands that it remains your responsibility to review and decide for each of your centers and yourself what is the best course of action or change in any form. PATH International isn't a policing agency, but we're here to provide guidance. The most important guideline, and I can't emphasize this enough, the most important guideline during this pandemic is for you to stay up to date with information, guidelines, and/or mandates from the CDC, your local, regional, and state government for reopening or anything else around the pandemic. Phases for reopening are being defined at the federal, state, regional, and local level. You'll need to check those guidelines to determine when you're able to reopen. And you'll need to determine whether, for example, in our state of Colorado, the governor came out with reopening guidelines and a reopening date, and then counties came out with their own reopening guidelines and reopening date. And the governor was very clear to say county mandates supersede the state mandates. So it's really important for you to understand what is going on in your state, what's going on locally, what's going on regionally. You'll need to stay up on that and check it on a regular basis as you're planning for your reopening. For example, again in Colorado, originally the reopen date was April 27th. It has now been shifted to May 11th. These things change on a continual basis. You can use this information to assure your center community that you are following appropriate guidelines while making this decision to reopen. Many assume that because you serve people with disabilities, you're serving a vulnerable population. And while they are probably vulnerable in a lot of ways, not all of them are vulnerable as defined by the CDC around this pandemic. So here is who is considered vulnerable to COVID-19 and should be considered a vulnerable population with this pandemic. People with chronic lung disease, serious heart conditions, immunocompromised systems such as cancer treatment, smoking, bone marrow or organ transplantation, immune deficiencies, poorly controlled HIV or AIDS, prolonged use of corticosteroids and other immune weakening medications, severe obesity, diabetes, chronic kidney disease undergoing dialysis, and liver disease. That list is on the CDC website. And so if you have it here, but if you want to double check that you've got the most up-to-date list, go to the CDC website to understand the vulnerable populations to COVID-19. The other issue we're getting a lot of questions about is a liability release. So it's really important to note that liability releases are state-specific. Again, we're not able to hand you a liability release and say, here, use this one, you're protected, because it is state-specific, and in order to get the best and most accurate advice on any changes to your liability release form, you need to check with a lawyer in your state or connect with other centers in your state that have checked with lawyers if you're comfortable with that. But the best advice is to check with a lawyer in your state. Now, one of our panelists, Emma, has provided a risk assessment document that she uses. You can find that in the handout section. This is not the same as a liability release. So I don't want anyone to think that that's going to protect them in the same way a liability release helps. But it's a good way to make sure that you and the participant or family are on the same page about them resuming attending services at your center. So just a reminder from the PATH International standards, it is mandatory that PATH International centers have a release of liability form signed by all participants, volunteers at the center. The language in the laws, various laws are different in each state. So again, it's really important that you double check with your state about whether anything should be updated to include COVID-19. Liability releases should always typically reflect the the specific type of activity the center provides. And just a reminder, there is still no guarantee that that liability release form is going to protect you. In terms of liability, the other thing to keep in mind about reopening is whether or not you are staying within the state, local, regional mandate in reopening, whether it's okay for you to reopen. So we talked to both Markel and Equisure asking, so would a center be covered if they operate during a stay-at-home mandate? Because some centers can argue they are providing an essential service. So just to be really clear, all insurance acts deny coverage for illegal acts of the insured. So on the face of it, if you operate during a stay-at-home mandate, that could be considered an illegal act. However, it's possible you could operate or partially operate legally if it's considered essential services. I know of one center in Washington State that worked with their local health department in order to get be told that one part of their service was considered an essential service, and it was legal for them to continue to operate. As with the liability release, however, your best advice is to contact your insurance company to double check before going forward. And in terms of liability, if someone were to contract COVID-19 from attending your center, again, you need to talk to your insurance company as to whether you are covered for anything of that nature. And always remember, we cannot control whether or not people decide to sue us. All we can do is try to have clear communication and really understand your insurance policies and your liability policies. But that is why I think Emma's risk assessment document is a great step, because that way you are getting really clear on whether or not you and the participant and the volunteers are on the same page in understanding the risks of coming back to the center. One of the other questions that we've been getting is, should centers now have a communicable disease policy? Where this falls for us is we ask you to review the Path International Standard A7, which states, for the purpose of risk management planning, is there written evidence that general health and safety concerns have been identified and established written procedures to respond are in place. Although infectious diseases are not specifically mentioned, they do pose a risk to general health and safety. So centers should consider including in their risk management plan how they plan to handle infectious outbreaks. Remember, COVID-19 is not the only infectious outbreak, and so it should be a general enough risk assessment to cover other situations beyond COVID-19. Our recommendation is to look at the infectious disease list information from the CDC and your risk management plan in order to make sure that you have plans for responding to any sort of infectious disease outbreak. Path International is in process of developing a precautions document that will help guide you taking precautions on behalf of your participants, families, guardians, volunteers, and staff. It is currently, the final version is with Health and Ed Committee, and we hope to have their response and finalize that document by tomorrow. If it is finalized at the same time that we're able to send the webinar recording, we will include that. Otherwise, we will make sure that we get that out to everybody as soon as it is finalized. One of the other questions that we've gotten is, can the horsehair transfer the virus? So I can't say we really know for sure. We do know that 2 cats, not the tigers, but domestic cats, were diagnosed with COVID-19, and so the belief is the owners transferred it to the cat. There's no evidence that the animals are transferring it to the humans. However, the recommendation from the CDC is that you treat your animals the same way that humans are acting right now, which is, don't let your neighbor pet your cat or your dog, keep a safe distance, etc. Now, what do we do about horses? How are you going to groom the horses? Well, obviously, you have to touch the horse, but you follow the rest of the recommendations that you would do with anything in terms of after you've touched the surface, hand washing and possibly disinfecting and being aware that you've touched a surface that could potentially transfer the virus from that surface to someplace else, like don't touch your face. Now, people have also asked about gloves. Right now, the CDC is not recommending gloves. And the reason is because the virus can live on the gloves and then transfer from wherever you just picked up the virus to the next thing that you touch. Now, obviously, that's different if you're using disposable gloves, but my question would be, would you really have enough disposable gloves to take them off and throw them away after every time you've touched a horse or touched another surface? So gloves are not recommended unless you have a way to wash them in between touching different surfaces. Oh, I forgot to be moving my slides. I apologize. I got all caught up in what I was telling all of you. Here you go. So the reopening is going to look different than a grand opening or starting a new year of programming. Reopening is going to look different than anything any of us have ever experienced. So the rest of what I just talked about and the rest of this webinar is meant to act as a guidance and resource. There are different topics, there are different areas that you really need to think about in terms of reopening. And I'm just going to go through them real quickly, and then we'll turn it over to the panelists who are going to start answering questions and talk about their plans and their experience. So programming, what does it look like? And how do you plan to evolve? And how do you choose which participants can come back, and are you going to get in trouble with the ADA? So the ADA is another guideline meant to guarantee access for people with disabilities to activities in public spaces. A PATH International Center may refuse access for safety concerns if it refuses access equally to all individuals with similar characteristics and if there's concern for the safety of personnel, volunteers, or other. So obviously those that are part of the vulnerable population. There's also some other guidelines about if you have a participant that isn't good at social distancing and isn't good with communication to understand why the social distancing should happen. Any of those types of things, you can also, especially when you initially reopen, you can say, we're not going to start with serving that particular population. And as long as you're consistent, you are fine with the ADA. Preparing equine. What do you need to think through? What do you need to make sure they're ready to go back into the arena and be part of services? Preparing staffing. Preparing volunteers. Universal precautions guidelines for everyone coming into your center. What do you need to do? What routines? Is it hand washing? Do you want to go as far as temperature taking? Again, there is advice and guidelines on the CDC website, but you need to decide for your center. Facility considerations. This is a big one. We got a lot of questions, and the panelists will talk about this. The cleaning protocol. I will say that the National Safety Council is identifying and working to mitigate safety issues as employers prepare to bring workers back into the field. Once we get a hold of those, we'll make sure that we get those out to all of you. TAC use and cleaning protocol. Concerns and fears. How do you address the concerns and fears that volunteers, staff, and participants may have upon returning? Is anyone surveying their folks? There are example surveys in the handout section provided by Hearts and Horses here in Loveland, Colorado, to survey their folks to measure the concerns and the fears. And how do you respect the outside lives of how everybody's being impacted by this, separate maybe from coming back to your center, whether that's staff or participants or volunteers. And then last but certainly not least, reopening communication plan. Several levels to that. That's not just about making a big announcement. Okay, we're open, come on out. You're going to have to communicate to your volunteers. You're going to have to communicate to your participants. You're going to have to communicate to your staff. What do you communicate? How do you communicate? When do you communicate? So our panelists will discuss each of these topics. As I said before, the webinar will be recorded and sent out following today's session. You can use the chat feature and the question box to send any questions. If we're able to and have time, we will address those specific questions. I would encourage you to really listen to all the different questions we're already going to pose, because my guess is that many of your questions will be answered. We will download the questions afterwards, however, and follow up if we were not able to answer something. So my final comment before introducing our panel. No one has all the answers for your particular situation, except for you. However, you're not alone. Just because you're the only one, you and your maybe staff and board are the only ones that can make these decisions for your center. You're not alone. PATH International is here just at the end of a phone call or an email. Even though our staff is working from home as well, we're all still here. But just as importantly, I know you're all here for each other. That's evidenced by the fact that we have almost 800 people on this webinar. And that's evidenced by the hard work I know that the region leadership teams, the region reps, and the state chairs have been doing in reaching out and checking on various centers and talking to each other about best practices. So please continue to seek guidance, particularly from the government sources, the CDC, but also from PATH International and each other. So it is my pleasure to introduce today's panelists. We have a 3-person panel here today to share their experience and suggestions around reopening. They each bring a unique perspective as we try to capture kind of the different perspectives that we know are out there for our center members. The webinar will follow a question-answer format, and the questions were basically put together on the questions people sent us, as well as questions that the panelists had thought up themselves as they were going through this process for themselves. So it is my pleasure to introduce our panelists for today. We have Emmeline, MS, HPCS, physical therapist, program manager, hippotherapy coordinator from Joyride Center, Inc. in Magnolia, Texas. We have Saebra Pipoly, owner of Hoofballs and Footballs based out of Phoenix, Arizona. And Kitty Stalsburg, Executive Director of PATH International Premier Accredited Center, High Hopes Therapeutic Riding Center, Inc. in Old Lyme, Connecticut. I want to thank each of the panelists so much for sharing your time and expertise. And now for your first question. What are the ways that people can start slowly reopening programming? How do they fairly decide who to start serving first? What does your reopen plan look like? And what will you do to prepare families for the new normal?
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you for being here today. That's an awful lot of questions just to kick off with. And there are some other information that I've shared with you regarding this, so we don't have to go into too in-depth right now as we're quite close with time. So if you look in the panel of extra information that you have, you will find our first draft of our infection control plan that may well help you. And as Kathy has already said, the first draft of our risk assessment. Probably over the next little while, these will continue to change. We'll continue to evolve depending upon how the situation locally to us changes. But these are some of our thoughts that we've had so far. So we only have a small staff here in Magnolia. So we pretty much are under the, we have the ability to bring the staff back already, and we're all working in the office. We will then start to bring some of the volunteers on site before we even think about the riders, and we're anticipating and hoping, and we're working towards as you know, a summer start date for our summer semester. Again, at the moment, nobody's promising anything. That well could change, as it is for every one of us right now. So we have gone down our usual situation of just getting people who are registering the interest of who wants to come over the summer, and we have a list of those. The we will be sharing all our policies and procedures so that both volunteers and riders' families know what we're putting in place and hopefully feel safe around that. We will then, take any questions, and if anybody else has any other thoughts or updates or anything that we can do to improve, then obviously that's another chance to do that. I think considering, obviously, as there's been a big question for everybody, it's the how do you bring back people first and who do you choose to come back first? Because we have the more medical and more vulnerable side of our program with the hippotherapy, we do have to be extremely careful with who comes back first. We will be doing phone call conversations with regards to the risk benefit, and we'll be documenting everything and making those decisions very closely with each family in turn, and they will be having to sign that they've had that conversation and that they are aware of the situation and the fact that nobody can guarantee that they are not going to get COVID or get any infection anywhere. So they need to understand that we are doing our absolute best, but that they are accepting the level of risk to come out and be served, as part of the community as they would always have to be. We are going to be training all our volunteers. We're going to be training all the families that come on site. We're going to be restricting the numbers of people that come through. Everybody will be getting lots more information by email, by telephone. We're making videos of the process of, what happens when you come on site. Where are you going to go? Where are you going to hand wash? Where are you going to stand? So hopefully they will all be fairly familiar with that before they even come back to property. I would like everybody that comes on our property to think, yep, they know that this is the new normal and that they are as familiar as they can be in amongst us still supporting them. We will be reducing the number that we have. We've only got, we normally only run sort of 3 classes every hour. Obviously, I'm in Texas, so we get fairly hot in the summer. So we will only be having a couple of classes in one go. We will make sure all the horses and everything are separate. There will be, lots of other things going on as well. So the main thing to me is that we communicate with everybody, both the volunteers and the riders, as well as with the staff. And we will be making sure there will be plenty of staff around to support the families and the volunteers as they come back. So we're kind of going to use the summer as like a slow opening ready for the fall when we have more people coming in, and obviously we will adjust things, as I'm sure everybody will, depending upon how it goes moving forward.
Kitty or Saebra?
I think Emma did a great job of talking about all the various elements for consideration. As we get through the rest, some additional questions, we can delve into some of those points a little bit more differently. And I think one of the key things, it's going to be very different in different scenarios, different centers, different populations. One of the things that I think Emma in the risk assessment is her population, the population that they're working with there is a greater percentage would be on that vulnerable scale, right, Emma?
Yes, definitely. The other thing that we will be doing as well is we're going to try not to just say no to people, you can't come. We are going to be offering, we do have a small facility to do some indoor lessons, and again we will keep that to a minimum, and we have policies in place for that as well, and also the virtual lessons as well. So all the while we're saying, okay, yeah, we're not quite ready to ride yet, but there are lots of other things that we can be doing with you in the process while we're waiting for a situation that is safe for you moving forward.
And what are you taking into account to determine which participants get to come back first to actual ride or actual in-person services?
Sure. Some of that will be dependent upon how much support they need while they're on the horse. So, I mean, obviously there's the medical side of things to start with, and, the conditions that are more at risk, the age of people as well, obviously considering the volunteers, that's just as important, and their health risks as well as the riders. So, and then we're kind of thinking that if anybody needs a thigh hold, then it's beginning to put you way too close to the clients for a very specific length of time. So if someone needs a forearm from the volunteers thigh hold on the client, it's also putting you very close to the clients and sort of more in front of them. So we're kind of figuring that if you have a knee hold on the client with your hands, so that you can actually be almost behind the client slightly, you're kind of out of their front area where if they cough, sneeze or otherwise, hopefully you're not going to be in full range of that. We have discussed over whether to have masks on everybody. We're kind of coming to the conclusion that we probably want masks on the volunteers. The riders will depend very much upon whether they can tolerate masks or not, and again their ability to cope. So for somebody who's got allergies and is likely to sneeze all the time, they need to be wearing a mask. For those that for the more speech end of the therapy spectrum that end up with lots of drooling when they start getting their systems regulating and the oral motor component, then again those kind of people would have to wear a mask, as opposed to our more the higher level just riding and the orthopedic end of our spectrum that can cope a little bit more and hopefully won't sit and do all the other things that some people are more likely to do.
And I might just jump back in and say, for some centers, this is a population, the population that Emma is working with regularly is a population that might be on your most involved. So for you, your phase one, like at High Hopes, is going to be we're looking more towards some of our independent riders who require only a horse handler, minimum physical contact. That's going to be our, as we think about the population and reopen. I think to Kathy's point earlier about ADA and the criteria that you establish, that's yours. This is your risk assessment in terms of who you can serve effectively, and make sure it's applied consistently and have that documentation. That's going to be your protection when someone says they're riding, why not me? And it may not be your participant, but it's likely to be the parent that is desperate for something for this person to do. And when we talk about the communication plan, transparency, honesty, and being consistent are going to be your best friends in this.
Yeah, that's
I
was going to echo that of what Kitty just said, and Emma's great thought process of all the pieces that they're considering is we can still be caring and understanding and maintaining relationships, but if you have a policy in place and you've made an educated decision and you have your whys behind it, don't give in, even if it's hurting to not do that. Because for overall well-being of everyone involved, just maintaining that consistency. So hold strong, be caring, but don't be afraid to stand your ground when it's a policy for your center that needs to happen.
Thank you.
I think it's that general reminder for everybody, if you do have questions, because we've certainly had some of our, even more medically vulnerable saying that they would like to attend, and it's like, because they put up with this kind of risk every day. This was normal for them even before COVID came along. And it's just that it's not just about them, it's about everybody. It's about, keeping everybody safe, the volunteers. We've got to have enough volunteers here that are comfortable to come, as much as it is looking after each individual rider. And I think most people, when you kind of start to think of the family as a whole, become a little bit more that it's not just about their particular person involved. Most people understand.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. Question number 2. How do you get the herd back in shape and ready to work? And what do you do with horses if you are starting slowly? Saebra?
Yeah, so really great question. And again, it's going to vary quite a bit from center to center and instructor to instructor of where you are at right now. So it's going to depend on whether or not horses have been completely off. Right, so you've been completely off. If you've been able to maintain some conditioning, if you've been able to maintain full conditioning. But we need to remember that in our industry, not only
Saebra, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you are breaking up. You may want to. I'm going to kick this to somebody else, and if you could call in, and you'll have better. Thank you, Kitty, Emma.
Sure. I think hopefully Saebra will be able to chime back in. It is going to be very individual, and to her point, it's going to depend upon what level of conditioning you are able to maintain during the break. The number of horses, their age, their overall condition to start with. Remember, just like humans, it doesn't take long to lose condition. Saebra, just let me know when you're ready to kick back in. Other considerations are you may want to start with a percentage. If you have a larger herd, maybe you want to bring 5 back initially. Obviously, you're going to come back with some considerations, hand walking, light riding, again, depending upon how long they've been out. You would need maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, depending upon where you're from, how long you've been out, if they've had minimal work, maybe they've been fortunate enough to be out and do trail riding or be turned out and moving around. So all of those things need to be given the consideration. We also discussed the need possibly to reacclimate some of these horses to the work that we're asking them to do. Do they need to be reacquainted with things on your trail, your arena, face masks, any of the other equipment that you use on a routine basis? Do you want to do them, particularly given the horse's longevity? You know, you may have a 25-year-old veteran that you feel pretty solidly confident with, but for maybe that younger horse, you might be coming back to earlier training techniques. Saebra, are you on?
I think I'm good to go. Can you guys hear me okay? Okay, goodness, technology. And I'm sorry if I, say anything Kitty just said. I couldn't hear audio while I was dialing in. But, bringing our horses back slowly, if need be, recognizing where they're at. I would highly recommend that you go through screening processes again. In the handouts under the COVID-19 resources, support resources PDF, there's actually 2 documents that are in there. One of them is a herd template document that you can go through and redo tack fitting, equipment fitting, reassess the strengths and the weaknesses of your equine coworkers, just so that you have a fresh start with our horses and not assuming that they're going to be coming back as the same horse, because they're individuals and they're going to be coming back, possibly differently. And then also, just making sure that they're good to go with all the different things that they might be seeing during lessons or sessions. So different, toys or props or whatever it might be. Don't assume that just because they were solid on something before that they're going to be solid coming back again. Make sure you cover your trail with documentation and track everything. There's a sample checklist training form in that support resources as well. So I would encourage you guys to go through that and use this time to listen to your horses and your equines coming back. If they're showing signs of stress or discomfort or negative behaviors, try to find the root cause while we're still slowly coming back, so that we don't, in an effort to serve the populations we're serving, kind of look over what our equine coworkers are trying to tell us. So make sure you're listening to your horses as you're bringing them back.
I think, may I just add as well, these are all fantastic points that we're all making. We're going to be doing some mock lessons as well, just with the staff beforehand, just to get them used to back to people that are on them that are unbalanced, and some of the things and movements that they have, again, may have forgotten about over the last few months, and having the volunteers next to them again as well. Obviously, you can't underestimate what it's like again, especially when they've been out and they've been off, having all that number of people around them again, if it's a horse handler and a couple of sidewalkers and those sorts of things. So it's, again, just checking and the desensitizing with that, as well as the other props and equipment, as everybody's been talking about.
Very good points, all of you. Thank you. I'm going to go off script because we're getting lots of questions in the question box about mounting and dismounting. You know, what if you, yes, have independent riders, so you don't have to worry about sidewalkers, but they actually need help mounting and dismounting? How are you going to handle that?
If I can talk to that a little bit, we're going to continue to, we use mount ramp most of our riders, and that will be with the instructor mostly. They usually have an offside as well. In that scenario, then everyone will be wearing a mask, because obviously you are in very close proximity. If we need to do a low thigh hold to walk them into the arena, then we will do that, and then we will reduce that level of support as soon as we can. So again, it's making a real good show, or making sure, demonstrating that you've washed your hands, done all the usual PPE and everything to CDC guidelines beforehand. I find generally the dismounting is often more of a concern than the mounting, just because of where clients are looking. So again, it's making sure that the clients are looking in specific places, so away from your general face. We tend to do crest dismounts here, so they kind of bring their offside leg up over the horse, over the front of their neck, and then they slide down between the horse and the instructor. And again, it would be making sure that the client comes down in a position so they're still facing forward. So again, you're kind of out of that front area, breathing or sneezing on somebody's face. Obviously, the other things are if you mount or dismount from the rump over the leg over the rump of the horse, then again you're turning the other way from your instructor anyway. So as long as you are maintaining that that zone around where you're breathing, then I think that's probably as best we can do under those circumstances.
Mm-hmm. And I'm, if I can jump in here, I'm seeing some questions pop up along the lines of the mounting, the dismounting, the sidewalking, and questions about training family members to either sidewalk or mount or dismount. I would just caution that if you choose to take this route, whoever is doing it, whether it's a family member or a caregiver, they need to be appropriately trained, just like you would train any other coach or sidewalker or mounting or dismounting. So just because that person is related to them does not mean that you can lax on your standards of training and practice and documentation. So be cautious with that, because not only are you exposing them possibly to the virus, but then also, you're exposing them now to equine safety risks when they're involved with sidewalking and mounting and dismounting.
And just another question came in about what happens when the rider falls off. And riders will fall off. If you're doing mounted activities, you're going to do everything you can to prevent a fall, but that is a risk inherent with therapeutic riding and the riding and mounted activities. So you need to be prepared to accept the consequences and the requirement for direct contact that's going to happen if a rider falls off.
Okay, thank you all. Next question. What is your staffing plan? Will you bring everyone back at once? How do you decide? Kitty?
Again, this is going to vary by center. It's going to vary by the number of staff. It's going to vary by the space that you have for staff and where they work. On the bright side, many of us have learned how to work very effectively from home. So the suggestion, or what we're planning to do, again, it's going to be within the phasing. The first week when we're working with horses may be more of the direct contact horse staff that might need to be there. Not all of the instructors, maybe some of the instructors, and we're going to stagger the work shifts so that we're not all there at the same time. We already do that if we need to. We're very careful about managing which doors people enter, how they enter. If for any of the folks that have ever been to High Hopes, we have a large room with many desks, and they are not all within social distancing appropriate space. So one of the very first considerations that we have is relocating people and making sure that we can either have, if appropriate space, looking at alternatives, workspaces within the facility. And again, going back to that, can someone work from home and do that remotely? One of the key points all along is going to be to limit your contact points. So the more people that you have in the same space, and that's where we're doing a walkthrough. Who needs to be there? Who's an absolutely essential personnel to provide this service? Same thing with your volunteers and your horses. Really look at those numbers. Do you need everybody there? Probably not at the same time. So, you know, maybe it's a different shift. In terms of just practical budgeting, you may not be able to afford to hire everyone back or bring all your employees back. So that is another consideration. What's your budget allowance? If you count on earned revenue dollars, likely that's going to be significantly impacted. If you're fortunate enough to get the Paycheck Protection loan, you know, maybe you are able to keep all your staff on, but you may have to consider reducing hours, furloughing and things like that. There also may be some things that you don't need everybody back for right away. Maybe you can have some of your instructional staff working remotely, doing virtual lessons. So a lot of different ways to think about this one.
I'm going to go off script again because there's still a lot of questions about the social distancing issue with sidewalkers, offside spotters, etc. And so are you suggesting to not resume services until that recommendation has been lifted, or are you suggesting that with proper safety you can restart some of those services utilizing sidewalkers and offside folks, even with the social distancing, which is a recommendation?
That's the big discussion point, because we're not going to be able to resume services with consistent social distancing. The horse handler is not going to be 6 feet away from the rider. They might be slightly off, so they're, as Emma's referred to, they're not in direct aerosol spray, but that's 6 feet is a good distance, and you can't be an effective horse handler in a team. You can't mount, you know, but what I'm suggesting is that if there are opportunities for you to maintain that social distance and think about that space and that the contact duplication, you want to minimize the touch points as much as you can as we start to think about disinfecting and cleaning.
And you know, going back to what Kathy had led off with is, what are your local guidelines? So what are they allowing right now? What are they recommending? And following those, because that's not a cut and dry answer that, you know, we as panelists can really give. It's going to depend on your location. What are the current rules? What do you feel comfortable with? What do the volunteers feel comfortable with? And what do your participants feel comfortable with as well, as maintaining local guidelines?
Exactly, and I'm just going to back that up and reinforce it again, because I'm seeing some specific questions like, well, what about the rule of no more than 10 people gathering? Well, the reality is that that rule is location specific. So you've got to check your local, regional, and state guidelines and see what applies to you. All right, I'm going to move on to the next question. How are you training your volunteers? Will your volunteer numbers drop due to being part of the older and vulnerable population? Emma?
Yes, we're getting quite a mixed response with all this. A number of our volunteers are older and or have people at home as well with other kind of medical conditions that they are concerned about as well. Those will not be coming back, and we are, you know, that's acceptable to us. We do not want anyone here that has no wish or concerns of risk to be here in any way, and we are supporting them in other ways and trying to include them still by getting them to do other things for us that they can at home. So that will be that group. We are finding that we're having some of the younger ones coming back more, partly because summer is coming, so the people that would normally be in school or college, they're beginning to want to come out and get some more volunteer hours and, for their resumes and things, thinking about college, especially as so many other programs have closed down because they're going to be inside or whatever. So those kind of people we're wanting to come back much more. So we kind of have both ends of that spectrum, and we're trying to manage that depending upon the needs and wishes of each individual volunteer. As far as training is concerned, then yes, again, they need to be trained in PPE, they need to be trained in hand washing, they need to be trained in social distancing, and they will be signing documents to say they've had the training. Some of that we will be sending them links to some OSHA level training that's online. We will be making videos ourselves, and then once they get back here as well, we will also be saying, okay, please, remember, you've got to wash your hands. We're going to do this, go through the systems and the procedures that we're going to have in place before we start a lesson. So just like you would do a safety check of the client and, with the helmet and the tack of the horse, part of that safety check again becomes, okay, has everybody remembered the procedures that we have in place? Has everybody washed their hands? Has everybody put their mask on in the appropriate way? And all those kind of things. The other point that we're getting quite a lot of, both from riders and volunteers, and I think now maybe is a good place to put this in, is that, we're getting some people who have been suggesting or disagreeing with the fact that we've shut down to start with, and that, they want to be out and doing things. Some people are getting bored and fed up at home. Some people just aren't understanding why we've needed to go to, this complete level of shutdown. And obviously that's a genuine concern from people as well. So our response to that mostly is to listen and to understand where people are coming from, and to know they're not alone, and obviously that their opinions are are valid for their own from their own perspective. But that obviously we have to consider the families as a whole. We have to consider the guidelines, as we've kept saying, from a both a local, county, state and federal level. And we have to follow those rules just as everybody else does. And we want to keep everybody safe. And that's not just whether it's an individual rider or an individual volunteer or a member of staff. It's to do with everybody all together. And once you kind of put things and phrase things in the term of the whole family of whatever centre it is, most people become a little more understanding of that. So we've tended to not have too many problems once we've had that conversation. So if that helps anybody.
Thanks, Emma. We are also getting a lot of questions about tack cleaning, facility cleaning, and I want everybody listening to know that that is on our list of questions to address. Okay, speaking of which, what are the universal precautions guidelines for everyone coming to your center? Are you going to require personal protection equipment? Are you going to have that available? Are you limiting number of people? Recognizing that gloves from outside can transfer the virus, what are you planning to do? Saebra?
Yeah, so great questions, very common questions that are coming up. Again, just referring everyone to the CDC website and the CDC current guidelines, and staying up to date on those. Because as we know, when we entered this whole virus situation, masks were not originally recommended. Now they are recommended. And I think it's very important for instructors and staff to understand what PPE is, so personal protective equipment, what's currently recommended and how it works. So face masks, the cloth face masks, are recommended right now to help prevent the spread of the virus. And so that if a person coughs or sneezes, that those droplets, the spray area is hopefully reduced a little bit. Wearing a mask is not intended to necessarily protect you. If someone sneezes on you, it'll help a little bit, but it's really meant to help prevent the spread and for it getting on surfaces and then someone touching a surface and touching their face. So that's a very important thing to understand. Also, PPE does not automatically include gloves. As of right now, gloves are actually not recommended by the CDC. There's no guidelines saying that we should wear them. The best practice right now is hand washing or hand sanitization. So washing your hands for at least 20 seconds in soapy water. So barns having stations set up for hand washing when people come in, have them wash their hands. In between handling horses and in between handling clients or participants, wash your hands. And then again, when you're done with whatever lesson format they're doing, even if it's an individual independent lesson, wash your hands before they leave, or have them wash their hands before they leave. The gloves, I would recommend that you guys do not let people wear gloves into your facility, because they might actually be transferring in germs and viruses on those gloves. Have them wash their hands, and that right now is best practice. Masks, you're going to have to, again, consider what your population is, who you're serving. Are they going to be able to tolerate that? Are you just going to have instructors and volunteers wear it because you guys are going to be close during those mounts and dismounts? So there's a lot of stuff that you need to think through and understand the appropriate usage of that equipment.
May I just add two things to that? That was fantastic, Saebra. That was a really good going over of the summary of everything. Two other things that might just give a few thoughts, especially for some of the clients that aren't used to seeing that level of PPE yet. Doing social stories in advance so they understand why all of a sudden their instructor or sidewalkers are wearing masks, or why they have to themselves, and checking if they're comfortable with those, getting the parents to perhaps wear them at home and try them out on their riders at home as well, maybe one way of going. The other side to that is the disposal of said PPE. So having trash receptacles that again are free of touching with your hands, making sure that you either put soiled substances in Ziploc bags and double bagging trash bags, and getting rid of all that on a routine and regular basis as well. So it's not just about the having it available and putting it on. It's about what do you do with it when you take it off, and how do you dispose of it. Please again refer to all your OSHA and local guidelines, to be up to date with all that kind of aspect of it as well.
And really quick, I see a lot of questions coming in of, are centers expected to provide this to your participants? I think that needs to be up to you on an individual basis. Financially speaking, you need to be considerate of your finances and whether or not you can afford to do that. And what type of equipment are you doing? Is it going to be reusable, washable face masks? Is it going to be disposable? And then if you are not doing a hand washing station, keep in mind that the recommended guidelines is that it has to be at least 60% alcohol for any type of sanitizing things that you put on your hands. So like a gel, it needs to be at least 60% alcohol, but keep up to date on CDC guidelines.
Very good. Thank you. What is the cleaning, disinfecting protocol for your facility? What do you use to clean, and what do you use to disinfect? Because those are two different things. Kitty?
And we've touched on this in the universal precautions, as well as the key is to recognize what is the difference between cleaning and disinfecting. You can't disinfect something unless it's been cleaned. So, and the reality is, I've saw some questions come in about saddles, about helmets. Anytime you're dealing with any of the organics, the brushes, the wood of the brushes, the leather, the bristles of the brush, all of those contact points are going to be virtually almost impossible to disinfect. And certainly you're not going to be able to disinfect that between each rider if you have back-to-back classes in any meaningful way. But backing up a little bit, I think the first real thing to think about is, are we even using the right disinfectant, and are we using it correctly? When you start looking, again, referring back to some of those resources, your guidelines on disinfectants, when you spray or utilize a disinfectant, are you leaving it wet on the surface and the times vary up to 10 minutes. How many of us are actually doing that? So make sure you understand what the requirements are of that specific disinfectant that you're using. When you decide to reopen, obviously you're going to want to do a very deep clean of your facility and a disinfect initially. When you start to bring your riders back, before you do that, you're going to look at your traffic flow patterns. Emma talked about making sure that, you know, trash receptacles don't have lids that have to be touched. Make sure that inner doors, outer doors, doors that automatic doors, things that people don't need to be putting their hands on. Limit those physical contact points as much as possible. Another question came in about helmets and borrowed helmets. I think in Saebra's comment, ideally it would be great if the population that returns brought their own helmets and utilized their own helmets and took them home, because you're, you know, cleaning chin straps. The reality is you're not going to be able to effectively disinfect those helmets and have them ready for the next rider. You know, you might have a process in place that could do that over a week's time. So there are many different ways to look at it. Again, probably taking the time, your staff ahead of time, to walk through the patterns that you're going to be using, limiting the tack that's being used so that you can clean your tack. And reality, you're going to clean it at the end of the day. You might wipe it down between participants, but when you start getting into the deep of the leather, any effective disinfectant is not going to be, it's going to harm your leather and some of your other products as well. I'm sure Emma and Saebra, I'm sure you guys have some things to chime in. There are some resources on the COVID-19 Path resource page that will address some of this as well.
Do you have any specific recommendations for a disinfectant to use or a cleaning product to use? Any of you, not just a kitty.
Well, and I would say that some of that's going to be based on availability. If you haven't already started looking for your masks, your hand wipes, your 60% Purells, you got to do that before you even think about reopening. Some of our larger, you know, manufacturing groups might be better options than opposed to, you know, your local grocery store. But Emma, what are you guys using?
I certainly agree with you there, Kitty. And certainly, if you start looking on most websites, then most people are saying they either haven't got the lead times for equipment and cleaning products is so long already. We were looking into getting a fogging machine as well for inside. And again, even get the lead time on those is a few months as well now. So who knows whether we'll actually manage to get one of those. So we're going to go probably with, you know, alcohol, you know, the appropriate proportion of solution of alcohol and bleach. You know, they're more regular kind of cleaning fluids, and they're all still subject to CDC guidelines, but it isn't quite as complicated as looking for particular brands and trying to check whether they are all individually CDC approved, and having to check lists and things all the time. But you know, the reality is we've all got to be inventive over this and just keep checking the guidelines, and hopefully we can you know, make sure at least at the very basics we're keeping everything as clean as possible and then disinfecting where we can.
And are you setting up a schedule? Not for the TAC, well, for the TAC too, I suppose, but for the facility where you say, okay, every 2 hours somebody is disinfecting all the doorknobs and that sort of thing.
We certainly, we're going to have little signs above all, you know, or certainly light switches as well as doorknobs and things as to, you know, of little elbows and things. Use your elbows as much as you can rather than hands if possible. We're going to go to the lengths of having charts up, just like you would see in a bathroom in a restaurant or a store, to say, right, on a given day, everything was cleaned at a particular time. We will have each instructor will have their own pen. We're going to make little aprons so that we all have our own little COVID protection pack with us all the time. It will carry a pen, it will carry tissues, it will carry sanitizers, it will carry Ziploc bags. So we all have our own little stash of equipment with us. And then we will be making sure we have particular designated areas. So the tack room will be out of bounds for only but a few staff. The clean tack will be put in a particular place. This is kind of going on to the next question already, which I appreciate we'll pause for in a moment. So there'll be clean and dirty places, and everything will be put in appropriately. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think to your point, Kathy, having a schedule is really important. And jumping all the way down to, we need to make sure that we communicate to our volunteers, our staff, and our participants the steps that we are taking to keep them safe, because they won't come back. They won't want to come back. And it's our responsibility to share all of the steps that we're doing so that they feel safe and comfortable and know that they're part of keeping that safe as well. So communication is going to be really important to this.
And back to what Kitty had touched
Saebra,
on,
we
the
can't hear
difference
you.
between cleaning and disinfecting. Oh, can you hear me now?
So yes, I can. So, but would you start over, please?
Okay, yeah. So touching back on what Kitty had said about the difference between cleaning and disinfecting, and centers and instructors being accurate in the terminology that they're using. So if you are only able to clean, you need to appropriately advertise that and not falsely say that you're sanitizing or disinfecting. So being honest with what you're truly able to do and provide. So just be cautious with that in the terms that are used.
All right, great, thank you. So yes, Emma, the next question is, how will you clean tack and what will your protocol be? How about the use of center helmets? Can they be cleaned enough in between? If so, how? Or should riders have to buy their own?
Great questions, as they all are. We're certainly going for, again, because of the populations that we have, most of our riders do have their own helmets anyway, but we would like to have every rider have their own helmet. We're trying to make provision that, you know, if we need to, we can support and assist them with that, and that may well be financially as well. We're looking into ways we can do that currently. We're also saying the same thing with reins. Reins has been coming up quite a lot, as I'm sure everybody else has been having these conversations. So again, some of our riders do have them, but certainly the more independent people and those that, you know, ride and use their reins very consistently and very well, we will be encouraging them to provide their own. Obviously, we'll be teaching them and supporting them and knowing what size and type to be having, whether it's a helmet, and again, looking at safety standards to make sure they buy something that is completely appropriate. We've had many conversations over tack, as I'm sure everybody else has. So as I was beginning to say before, we are going to be making sure that everybody is aware that on the whole, realistically, the best we can do is clean everything, particularly the saddles, particularly all the leather components. We will be using synthetic and fabric of various sorts where we can, and we'll be laundering as often as we can to keep everything as clean as possible. We will have clean areas, so we will have only, we have like 3 areas to cross tie. So we will have the 2 outside ones where the horses go. The clean tack will be in the middle of that in the spare cross tie area. We will have a dirty area around the back of our ramp, which is very well away from any families and other people. It's sort of restricted access area anyway. So that will be where all the dirty tack goes. There will be buckets there of appropriate cleaning solutions. There will be areas to dry everything off for as long as it needs to, and that will be done on a routine basis. Some of our volunteers that aren't overly comfortable still with coming back and participating in lessons have offered to come back and help us with that, and that's going to be a great help in reducing the burden on the staff at any one time as well. We're aiming, if we can, to try and limit the amount of use of any particular piece of tack in any one day, and certainly between morning and evening sessions, that everything gets cleaned. Will be cleaned obviously within each session, but hopefully one piece of tack will only be used in the morning and then in the evening. It's the same for the horses too. We can, you know, wipe down with water. You know, certainly the neck area and the mane, the area in front of where a rider sits between classes. We're hoping to limit the amount of times a horse is used, but practically, you know, they probably will have to be used a little bit, if not back to back, but certainly once or twice during the day. We have a quite big, thick woolen Western pads that go under our Western saddles. We've got a lot of like baby blankets that will go over the top of those. So again, we're going to be covering the pads and then obviously just cleaning the saddles very well in between each use, and then laundering the baby pads that go over the top of the Western pads. That's the best thing that we've managed to come up with so far with regards to that. So yeah, again, it's the buckets, the tubs of disinfectant and cleaning solutions, making sure everything is in there long enough, making sure everything dries long enough, and then obviously changing the cleaning solution in that bucket and cleaning the bucket frequently throughout the day, as well as actually just cleaning the tack. So good. Kitty or Saebra, like to add anything else? I'm sure there's something I've missed off of there.
For those individuals that are wanting to cover reins or cover saddles with something, just be considerate of what you're using. So is it cloth? Is it plastic? Just don't assume that just because you pull it off that you're not then possibly transferring it back on. And then also be aware of any sounds it might be making. So especially if you're using some type of, you know, plastic covering, is that going to be safe? Is it going to slip on the equipment? Is it going to cause the saddle to become slippery? Is it going to cause the reins to become slippery? Is it going to create a noise that might our equines might not be used to? So just with all these things that we might have to be adding in, remember to introduce it to your equine coworkers so that we're being safe about adding in these additional safety measures.
And we have a question about where do you find this? Where do you find the covers?
For saddles or for other pieces of tech? So for all those reasons that Saebra's just pointed out, we've decided not to try and cover the saddles, that we will just clean them as thoroughly as we can between. The only covers that we're going to be using, as I say, are baby pads on the Western saddle pads, not on the saddle themselves. So they will be laundered in between. It's just a layer of fabric that will go in between the saddle and the Western pad.
I just wanted to chime in and say, you know, for all of these three areas, when we're thinking about cleaning and disinfecting, there are lots of resources out there, maybe not specific to the equine environment, but go to your health professionals in your town, director, go to your fire marshals. Every town, I just had a wonderful conversation with our emergency director in town here, and while I'm not considering High Hopes as an essential service, he said, of course you are. You're there and you have people taking care of your horses. That's essential service at this point. And, you know, to that end, he helped us procure some masks today that we hadn't had. So talk to those officials as you start to think about reopening, and bring in other people to do the walkthrough, to look over your protocols, to ensure that you haven't miss something that somebody who does this on a routine daily basis in another avenue of life might just simply say, why don't you do this? Come in this door, go out that door, and don't, you know, do a one-way flow, something simple like that.
And take a page from the businesses that have remained open or are open. You know, that I know here in Colorado, for example, the grocery stores now have an entrance and an exit. You don't enter and exit in the same spot. You know, they are recommending masks, but they're not requiring them, and things like that. So what Kitty said, and also really look around to the businesses that have been open and see how they are, what their protocol is. All right, I'm going to go to the next question. We've got 2 questions left. How do you address the concerns, fears that volunteers, staff, and participants may have upon returning? Is anyone surveying their folks? And again, I will direct you to the handout section where we have some examples provided by Hearts and Horses. How do you respect outside lives and how they have been impacted? And how do you mitigate the stress of all this change on staff, volunteers, and participants? Saebra?
Yeah, so I think it's been really great hearing these questions come up frequently of, how do we be aware of how our volunteers and our staff and our participants are feeling, especially being concerned about volunteers and staff, because I think we tend to prioritize our participants first because that's who we serve. But I would encourage you guys to reach out, whether it's over the phone, through surveys, emails, even if you're not looking to reopen immediately, start that line of communication, and let them know that it's okay to have honest, open conversations with you and let you know that they're not okay right now, or they're not okay to come back in the capacity that they were volunteering or working in before, and see why they're not able to, what factors are impacting them personally, so that you can just be aware of that as you're interacting with them. And listen to people as well when they tell you those factors that are impacting them and how it's impacting them. And just like we listen to our participants really well and we don't downplay what they're saying, extend that to your volunteers and your staff as well. And, Hearts and Horses did a wonderful job of putting together those surveys. So I would highly recommend that you resource those and follow up on the surveys as well and reach out to those individuals.
Anything to your Emma?
I think recognizing also, as Saebra said, this is everyone has something. And, when I talked about what staff come back, the first step of that is actually having individual interviews with your staff members. Are they comfortable? Do they feel that they're bringing risk to their family or vice versa? Are there situations at home that you're not aware of? So I think that kind of conversation needs to happen with everyone to the best of your ability.
And a subset of this question is about charging. What do you charge? Do you give refunds for the time that you were suspended? How do you decide what is appropriate to charge in our new reality?
Mm-hmm. I think that's really going to have to be determined center by center, instructor by instructor, because we're all in unique situations. For example, I'm not a nonprofit, so my answer would be different potentially than a nonprofit. And large nonprofits versus small nonprofits, that's going to really depend on your funding sources and your revenue and the populations you're serving and whether or not you're in a lower income community. There's really a lot of factors that you need to reach out and do some research on, and maybe it's you reach out to the families and see if they need a refund or if they're willing to donate that to help support the horses in the center. So that's really going to have to be on an individual basis. I would encourage instructors and centers to reach out to each other and in your area and see what you guys are doing as a whole to kind of gauge the temperature of your own area.
Okay, thank you. Last question. What is your reopening communication plan? Kitty?
And we as a panel selected this question last because it's an opportunity to tie everything that we've just talked about in. Your communication plan shouldn't just be about reopening. Hopefully you've been in consistent communication with all your entities. Even in the last question, what's the health and well-being of staff, volunteers, participants? That level of support from you, from your center, is what will help them not be surprised. We don't have all the answers. You don't have all the answers. You've heard us say repeatedly, check this, check that. The answers are changing every day based on the news and frankly on the virus. As we learn more things about it, how it's transmitted, how, what things work, what things don't, the timing. So be transparent in that lack of definitive knowledge. This is the best. Emma, you've said a lot in your conversation. You said, this is what we came up with. This is what we think will work. And that's communicate. I think the other piece about this is what we have come up with to keep you safe. There is a group that we haven't talked about, and a little bit in that last question was our donors and our bigger community. And that's, I think, where your communication plan has to extend to as well. You need to let them know that you're here, you're in it for the long haul, you plan to reopen when safe to do so. These are the steps that we're going to do to keep you safe and to be here for you. It's also important when you're thinking about reaching out to those people in your community, your fire marshal, your emergency departments, and let them know that you want to learn. Make sure they're keeping you, your youth service bureaus, make sure that you are staying in their minds, because maybe it's your donors that will understand that your participants are having significant financial challenges right now, and they want to support general operations. For those of you who've ever asked for money, general operations is usually not where you can get it. This is the time to get that funding. The conversation with your participants about whether you give a refund or whether you ask them to contribute back, that has to be done in a way that is mindful of individual situations. If you can afford to support us at this time, we would invite you to do so. If you can't, we absolutely understand. Let us know and we will credit you for the next semester. We will give you a full refund. Be available, have those conversations. If you have the opportunity, talk with every single participant, their family, their schools. If you have social service agencies out there and you have contracts, talk with them, see what they are thinking about. Your schools might be more amenable to putting it to a credit, so maybe it's not a full refund if you work with schools, but that communication needs to be on an ongoing basis. You may want to designate a single spokesperson for your organization for consistency. It doesn't have to be the executive director. You may want 3 different people. You may want your executive director, your board chair, and your program director. You may want to write a script so that you have, consistency in your answers. You want to make sure that everybody's on the same page. That's out there talking to the public. I'll let others chime in. I could go on for a long time. So if you reach out to me directly.
I would suggest that in our communication with our volunteers and our staff and participants and donors, to remember the different learning styles, even in communication. So recognize that written communication is not always going to be the best way. Don't be afraid to get out your camera phone and take a video of it, do a little audio recording, get that information out in various ways, because that might really, really help you reach some people who just may see that email or that letter from you and not read it because it's so much, it's words. Don't be afraid of it not being a professional video. Just be honest, be open with your communication, but remember the different learning styles of the different people that we're having to communicate with.
The only thing that I might add is that you need to sit down and identify who your audiences are and what the difference is in terms of communication, not just the style, but although that's a great point, Saebra, but also what is it that you need to communicate to your volunteers, to your participants. So define who your audiences are as you determine what communication is going to happen. So with that, I'm going to wrap this up. According to my clock, we have just 2 minutes, so we are ending on time, which I appreciate. Kitty, Emma, Saebra, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise and your plans with almost 800 of our members who are all asking these questions and working to roll out their own plan and open safely and strategically. I'm going to say it one more time. That it is really important to check your local guidelines, to understand, are you considered an essential service in your community? Do they still have the 6-foot social distancing, and can you choose not to do that, and that's okay. But it has to be your community. Talk to your local health department. That's a really good resource. And speaking of resources, this webinar will be sent to you the handouts will be sent to you. The resources that are under our handout section, that there's, for example, there's a link to a great article about the cleaning your facility. So there's lots of really good resources. I encourage you to take a look at those handouts. You can either get them later or you can download them today. So again, panelists, thank you very much. I hope that everyone is taking at least one or two really good gems away that is going to help them in developing their reopening plan. Path International is going to continue to provide our COVID bulletin, as well as produce these kinds of webinars when there is a topic that is pertinent to all of our members. And if you have ideas for that, please feel free to email me about any ideas of a webinar that you think is timely and pertinent to our entire membership. And we hope that everybody stays safe and healthy. And thank you for the good work you're continuing to do and the thoughtfulness with which you are approaching this to help keep you strong, the industry strong, the center strong. We are all in this together, and reach out to each other, reach out to the Path International office if you have other questions. As I said, we'll look through the questions and see if there's anything that didn't get answered that we want to try to get an answer out to everybody. But otherwise, if you feel like your question didn't get answered, feel free to call the Path International office, and we will get an answer to you as quickly as possible. So once again, thank you so much for joining us today. And boy, I look forward to actually seeing some of you not in a box at some point in the future. Take care.
Thank you, Kathy.